So the 1800s in Britain was a time of great change, and one of the most challenging things for the established upper classes in Victorian society was the influx of people viewed as working class or lower class into the big cities. They were coming in search of work and housing, but the cities of the time, especially London, were quite unprepared for them. And the sudden increase in numbers made the upper classes nervous. They were clearly becoming outnumbered, and they began to create areas of these cities where they would go and other areas where they would not go. And this division of the cities into no-go areas was interesting because it created a sort of other side to London. Now, rich people tended to live in the West, and stories of the debauchery and the goings on in places like the East End and Soho were shocking and fascinating to them. Now, many stories and novels from this time fall into the category of shilling shockers, stories that were written about these other people in order to shock, appall, and entertain the upper classes. The lower classes about whom they were written were largely illiterate, so they weren't the intended audience of the stories, they were just the subjects of the stories. Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde, however, was written about the sort of upper-class gentlemen whose wives would have read these shilling shockers, and as a result it caused quite a stir, quite a controversy. It was seen as typical of the lower classes to engage in this sort of behaviour. So, for example, it was thought that there were thousands of prostitutes in the East End of London at the time the novel was published. But for a well-respected gentleman to have such a dark side to him was truly frightening. The allegorical nature of the story was not lost on its audience at the time that it was published. Now, an allegory is a story or a poem or a picture which has a hidden meaning or a moral, maybe a political or moral meaning. But the thing about an allegorical story or an allegorical text is that it's really obvious. So, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe is an allegory. Aslan counts as Jesus, who dies to redeem somebody else and then comes back to life. It's very obvious. And, other texts have kind of links and metaphors and themes, but if it's very, very obvious, then it's an allegory. So what about this text then? Well, many readers saw Jekyll and Hyde as a morality tale of what can happen when you indulge or give in to your darker side. And this is shown in the novel as it is indeed the dark side that wins out and claims Jekyll. The nature of class is interesting in Jekyll and Hyde because there's no one really of the lower classes that's represented in the story except, possibly for, Hyde himself. The other thing that's worth thinking about is medical discovery. So science and medicine were changing quickly at the time that the book was written. And as we've seen already in this video series, famous surgeons were experimenting with dissecting bodies to learn all they could about human anatomy. The first transplants were carried out around this time too by this guy and his sort of other people in the scene. This is John Hunter. Now, Hunter conducted bizarre experiments where he grafted a human tooth onto a chicken's head to see if it would grow, as well as many other experiments. And this notion of the mad scientist shocked the public, and many of the experiments were carried out in secret, and their results shared among respected members of the profession in private houses around Britain. Now, these themes also carried through to Jekyll and Hyde, where we see Dr. Jekyll in his London home with his labs and powders locked away with his research. He begins to experiment on himself, which John Hunter is also supposed to have done, and soon he gets into a situation that he can't handle. Now, this is a common fear of the Victorian age, of discovering something shocking or creating something monstrous. Think of Frankenstein, and I've got an ebook and video series on that too. That would overpower and destroy us. And we still see this as a relevant fear today, this idea of artificial intelligence, taking over. Now, Stevenson is addressing these concerns only this time, instead of being a creation or something terrible from the East End of London, like in most of the shilling shockers of the day. In this case, the monster comes from within. It already exists. All that is required is some medical marvel to unleash it and destroy its other better half. Now, finally, I want to talk about the development of psychoanalysis. Stevenson, according to his wife, read many reports, mostly from France of the growing field of psychoanalysis and dream analysis, and he was obsessed with dreams, their meanings, and their relation to our subconscious selves, or as Stevenson christened his other self, the other fellow. Now, Stevenson's wife even went so far as to claim that the seed for Jekyll and Hyde actually came from a French scientific journal. Stevenson said he had read a scientific article about a young Frenchman who developed a case where he would have dramatic and severe personality shifts as a result of severe shock, but he maintained that he had read the account after the publication of Jekyll and Hyde. But whatever you think about its roots, it's difficult to resist seeing many parallels with the work of Sigmund Freud, the most famous psychoanalysis sort of figure, and the man who is seen as the father of psychoanalysis. Freud was a few years younger than Stevenson, but it's very likely that they would have been reading the same journals and articles, and so would have been exposed to the same ideas. Some of Stevenson's ideas predate Freud's, especially those of the duality of man, but their similarities are very clear. Freud's theories cover the idea of the subconscious and how the conscious self, that is the public self, covers up the desires and wishes of the subconscious, the private self, until as we grow older, we completely forget the subconscious. He is able, according to his research, to access a patient's subconscious through dialogue, and in many cases able to identify and locate the cause of some illness of the present in the patient's past, usually linked to a suppressed and covered up event in childhood. As an Austrian, Freud would have not necessarily shared the Victorians' general aversion to anything related to sex, and as such, many of his theories relate to the repression of sexuality and sexual inclination, and again, this is something that does appear to be central to our understanding of Jekyll and Hyde. Now, similarly, another book published at the time, and one that was entirely shocking yet widely talked about, was this one on the screen, Psychopathia Sexualis, written by another European, Richard von Krafft-Ebing. Now, his book was a study of sexual behaviour in people, and it included many case studies and interviews. To the Victorian society, for which any talk of sexuality was completely forbidden or spoken about in metaphors and knowing glances, this was a treasure trove of information to be appalled by. And it was published around the same time as Jekyll and Hyde, and Jekyll and Hyde was subtle enough to leave most of the details up to the imaginations of its readers, and that means that Jekyll and Hyde took on really a very new meaning, possibly many different and conflicting meanings, in its readers' minds. Jekyll and Hyde, then, is a book of its time. It was a time when medicine was about to unveil the inner mysteries of human anatomy, when psychoanalysis was about to unveil the inner mysteries of the human mind and human sexuality, and also a time when class and political tensions were threatening the established status quo, the cosy consensus that had existed for the upper classes for decades. To say the Victorians were neither ready nor equipped for all these changes is an understatement, and in this context, Jekyll and Hyde emerges to shock, to fascinate, and to hold up a mirror to the people who were reading it. Hope you found this useful, guys. Please do subscribe to the channel.